Welcome everyone to today's UC seminar. We are especially pleased to have Madeline Creedon with us today. My name is Alex Littlefield. I'm the Chief of Staff and Fellow here at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS for short, and I thank all of you for being here today. NIDS is a 501c3 think tank whose motto is Think Deterrence. We are laser focused on the theme of deterrence, and we promote this focus through our weekly podcast, The NIDS View, and on occasion, NIDS Knowledge, and our Global Security Review, which is our journal. We also have events which are, besides the virtual ones, we have in-person events here in DC, as well as a NIDS Academy. We're proud to have Senior Fellow Peter Hussey as a key part of our organization and as our host for Hussey seminars. Peter brings a wealth of knowledge, connections, and insight to our organization. Before Peter introduces our speaker, I would like to encourage anyone in the audience to direct message me in the chat if you would like for me to turn on your camera and mic to ask a question directly to Madeline. Our audience has always been good about asking succinct questions at the end end with a question mark. So let's continue this practice. Now over to you, Peter.
Oh, thank you very much, Alex and Madeline. Welcome. It is wonderful knowing you. Madeline was on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I believe, when I met her. She then went to become the Deputy Administrator of NNSA, and then she was also a senior official in the Department of Defense. And she was the chairwoman of the Posture Commission, which report came out in October of 2023. And she has been invited to come here and talk to us about what the commission found, what things we ought to take from it. And that's over to you, Madeline. Again, on behalf of NIDS, we're very grateful for your participation, and it's great to have you here.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. And I very much appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk about the report of the Strategic Posture Commission. As you mentioned, our report was released in October of last year, and our timing just couldn't have been worse because we had our rollout 5 days after Hamas invaded Israel. So it's taken a while for the report to gain some traction, but I'm very happy to say that it is. And having this opportunity today, I think, is just indicative of the fact that it is actually getting more traction and more attention, which I think is a good thing. I just want to start with, again, thanking you for having the focus and attention on our report. And I also note that you've got 2 more sessions on the report upcoming, one with Frank Miller and one with Rose Gottemiller. So I appreciate that as well. I want to start, though, with a comment that the report is the report of the Strategic Posture Commission, not the Nuclear Posture Commission, but the Strategic Posture Commission. So as a result, we are way more than just looking at and talking about and reporting about things nuclear, although obviously the nuclear posture, force structure, and strategy plays a large part in our report. So the report was the work of 12 commissioners appointed by 12 members of Congress, 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. We were 6 men and 6 women. And for those of you who are into this sort of data, 4 of the women and 2 of the men were appointed by Democrats, and 2 of the women and 4 of the men were appointed by Republicans. So we were a very diverse group. The vice chair was Jon Kyl, the former senator from Arizona. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the wonderful support from all of the folks at the Institute for Defense Analysis, as well as our executive director, Bill Chambers. So this report is consistent with the commission's statutory charge, which was to conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States, including a strategic threat assessment and a detailed review of nuclear weapons policy, as well as nuclear weapons strategy and force structure, and factors affecting the strategic stability of new peer competitors of the United States and peer and near-peer nuclear power competition. The report is threat-informed, it's forward-looking, it's nonpartisan, and it's consensus. And that in and of itself, that consensus part is amazing, frankly. I never thought we'd get there. I never thought we'd get to consensus, but we did. And the fact that we actually achieved consensus, I think, is what makes this report a pretty powerful report. Because when you look at the members of the commission, we are a very disparate bunch. I often refer to ourselves as being eclectic. But nevertheless, we took our tasking seriously, and we were all fully committed to achieving consensus where we could. The report provides high-level guidance to shape future decision-making, and it generally refrains from choosing specific systems. As a result, we provided characteristics of recommended capabilities, but we did not intentionally pick the winners and losers. And so what I mean by this is you will not find in this report a specific endorsement, for instance, of the SLCM-N. What we do talk about is the characteristics that are needed for theater nuclear systems, particularly in the Asia Pacific. So the time frame for our report is 2027 and beyond, looking at least to 2035. So it's very much of a long game report. And although the report is hard-hitting, it's also fairly subtle. And this subtlety has led to some confusion about what the report does and does not recommend, including that we are not recommending substantial increases in the U.S. nuclear force, and we do not endorse, nor did any of us want, a new nuclear arms race. That said, more non-nuclear capabilities are definitely needed. And by this, I mean things like tankers, more cyber, more early warning, more ISR, more hypersonics. But that's really where there's much more emphasis on more is on the non-nuclear capabilities. So we all know the threats from China and Russia are different, but they're both growing rapidly. China is developing a true nuclear triad more rapidly than expected. It is increasing its nuclear stockpile, and it appears to be moving away from a no first use posture. Both China and Russia are engaged in coercive and aggressive behavior regionally, posing a significant threat to our allies and partners. And of course, the goal is to deter any military action in either region, either the European theater or the Asia Pacific theater, and to convince our adversaries that any military actions against any ally is not worth the price. Both Russia and China are trying to divide U.S. alliances. They're trying to challenge and limit the U.S. role in the world and expand their own influence and leverage. Russia is expanding the number and type of its non-strategic, in other words, non-treaty accountable weapons and delivery systems. It has suspended the New START treaty and has significant strategic warhead upload potential in its modernized delivery systems that it could implement after the New START treaty expires in 2026, if it shows. Russia is about 95, if not 100%, but at least they have stated that they're about 95% complete in their modernization program. And if you look at their delivery systems, you just see that they're, for the most part, they're new. The hopeful environment and the vision of widespread nuclear reductions from a decade ago, sadly, is no longer realistic, and the prospects for agreements on nuclear arms control today appear bleak. Russia has unsigned the CTBT. It's withdrawn from the Open Skies and the CFE treaty, and of course, it violated the INF treaty. The first Strategic Posture Commission, established in 2008, because we were not the first, we were actually the second, had a charge very similar to ours. In other words, to conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States and to make a recommendation on how to move forward. But it was a very different time, and the policy considerations on which the first commissioners were most focused were very different from today. In their 2009 report, the policy balance was between the need to maintain an effective nuclear deterrent on the one hand, and on the other, still lead international efforts to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation and reduce the saliency and number of nuclear weapons globally. That commission also hoped the world would head in a direction in which proliferation and nuclear terrorism are reduced, and where there is cooperation among major powers to ensure strategic stability. They rejected specifically the vision of a world defined over the next decade or two by a renewal of competition for nuclear advantage among the nuclear powers. Well, sadly, that world didn't come to fruition. But we now have the world we have, and that world presents us with the potential for two nuclear peers. China, of course, isn't a nuclear peer just yet, but if it continues on its current trajectory, it will certainly be in the next decade having a full triad. The US, as a result, is on the cusp of a fundamentally different global setting, for which we as a nation did not plan. It's certainly not what we wanted. And as a result, we are just simply not well prepared. So the commission focused on getting prepared, laying the foundation now for decisions in the future. The commission wanted to ensure that decision makers can actually make decisions, that they have options, and that those options can be implemented. So facing and confronting two nuclear peers is unprecedented, but the ultimate question is, okay, now what? How does the US maintain its leadership role in the world, preserve the rules-based international order, stay aligned with allies, preserve, which, by the way, is preserving a considerable strategic advantage that we enjoy and Russia and China do not, and how do we fundamentally deter conflict? Most importantly, how do we not only deter that initial military conflict of a conventional nature, but how, more fundamentally, can we credibly deter nuclear conflict at any level? The challenge, as laid out in the report, is to build a strategic posture that has the highest probability to secure and further US vital interests into the future, as well as prevent a major power war or nuclear employment. So we did not see that there was a significant threat, really, of a large nuclear exchange. What we did see, and what we concluded is a growing threat, is the possibility of nuclear exchange in a regional context. Lower yields, smaller numbers, but something that would occur in the aftermath of a conventional conflict. So to repeat, we didn't plan for this environment that we're in, and we didn't want it, and we're not prepared. So now we have to recognize the hard facts and get prepared. As a nation, we must act now and with a sense of urgency that the commission did not always see. This is one, and so the whole concept of urgency is one that the commission reiterated over and over. I think at one point somebody counted, and we may actually have used the word urgency on the order of 40 times. So this is clearly something that we want to bring to the attention of everyone, the administration, Congress, the Hill, and just people, that it is time now. We have to take steps. The steps need to be taken now to enable both near and longer term decisions. It's essential that what the US does now and in the next few years enables the flexibility that will most likely be needed to reshape the conventional and nuclear force structure and not foreclose options that might be needed in the future. So, for example, on the assumption that the US will need more Columbia-class submarines, although we don't even have the first one yet, but on the assumption that maybe we might, if there are contractual provisions that need to be exercised now to enable additional ships down the road, they should be taken. If we don't actually purchase them down the road, well, that would not be terrible. But if the decision is needed to actually purchase them and we don't have the option to purchase them, that would be certainly a loss. So we have to make sure that not only do we shape our force structure for the future, but that we do not foreclose any options that might be needed. But in the near term, because we do have to look at this too, particularly after the expiration of the New START treaty, and if nothing replaces it, there are steps that we can take in the near term, and we should prepare for those now as well. So, for instance, we should prepare, if needed, after the expiration of the New START Treaty, to upload warheads to the Minuteman III ICBMs. We can plan and prepare to reconvert B-52 bombers. So as you know, some of these bombers had been converted from nuclear use to conventional only. Well, we should plan and understand how to reconvert these bombers back to being all nuclear capable bombers. We can plan and understand what it takes to remove the ballast from the Trident SSBN submarines. 4 of the tubes on each Trident submarine now contain ballast, and we should look to plan to prepare to remove the ballast and put those tubes back into service. In other words, put D5 missiles back into those tubes. We can initiate advanced procurement for additional capabilities and size the infrastructure to meet any reasonable contingencies. That said, there is no reason to stop pursuing broader risk reduction efforts when achievable and in the U.S. national interest. If there are opportunities for arms control, strategic stability talks, military to military talks, confidence building measures, Track 1.5's Track 2, whatever those opportunities are, they should all be explored. So there are 5 fundamental assumptions that underpinned our report. The first is that Russia and China will continue their current respective adversarial paths, each growing the quality and quantity of their nuclear arsenals. China will continue to grow its conventional forces, including its space and cyber capabilities. Russia will also grow its space and cyber capabilities, and each will continue their aggressive foreign policies and seek to supplant the U.S. global leadership role. I'd like to add here that this aspect of making sure that the U.S. maintain its global leadership role is a key element of our report. And the very first chapter of the report, which we have entitled The Stakes, lays out why this is fundamentally important. The Commission felt that the U.S. must maintain this leadership role. We must maintain our alliances, and we are the ones who, certainly since the end of World War II, have maintained the stability and the economic prosperity globally. And we cannot allow isolationist forces to deter us from keeping that leadership role. The second underpinning is that today's one major war strategy construct is no longer viable, particularly given China's current trajectory. And this is also one area where there is a substantial difference between the report of that initial posture commission. That initial posture commission was focused on Russia. It hardly even mentioned China. And as we've seen since 2009, China's modernization is growing exponentially. When we talked with our IC colleagues, which we did to substantial extent at the beginning, one of the things that our IC colleagues mentioned is that very often they've been wrong. For instance, they would say China will have 5 things in 10 years, and in fact, they end up with 10 things in 5 years. Their trajectory is so rapid that it in and of itself is also unprecedented. And third, the 6 foundational, long-standing tenets of U.S. nuclear strategy remain valid. So these are basically these objectives that shape nuclear defense and planning are maintaining assured second strike, having a flexible response, maintaining the principle of tailored deterrence to ensure that the U.S. nuclear strategy accounts for the unique aspects of each potential adversary's decision calculus, extended deterrence and assurance, and this is especially important, that confidence in U.S. extended nuclear deterrence enables U.S. allies and partners to stand with the United States in opposing threats to mutual vital interests posed by nuclear armed adversaries, and also eliminates their need for developing their own nuclear weapons. Calculated ambiguity and hedging against risk. And number 4, we also need strong allies and partners. They are essential. They make us all stronger, but we also need greater cooperation, coordination, and integration. And by integration, we meant not only integration in planning, but we also meant integration in military hardware, in capabilities, so that we truly can operate as a linked, functioning, coordinated force. The US deterrent fundamentally must be credible, and it must be seen that way by our adversaries as well as our allies and partners. In addition, the US needs a true whole of government approach to deter and prepare for the possibility of a two-theater conflict, even if one of the conflicts is opportunistic. And this is very hard. And it's sometimes, well, I have to confess, and sometimes when I've talked about this particular recommendation of the commission that we need a whole of government approach, there's some eye rolling going on, and it's not exactly something that's taken seriously, but it is absolutely essential. We have to figure out how to do a whole of government approach to deterrence. The U.S. defense and nuclear strategy must be implemented to effectively deter and defeat simultaneous aggression in two theaters. So yes, the commission did place a very large homework assignment at the feet of the administration. So we laid out the program, and now it's up to the administration to figure out the appropriate defense and strategy needed to address two nuclear peers who might, in fact, engage in either simultaneously or sequential aggression in two theaters. China can no longer be considered a lesser included case for force structure planning. This has been the case for years, but when you look at their rapid modernization, it's obvious that this is no longer the case. And nuclear and conventional force sizing and composition must reflect this strategy. Risk reduction and arms control remain important tools, and as I mentioned, we should find every opportunity to take advantage of any options. Obviously, real traditional arms control treaties have very little hope at the moment, sadly. And with the New START treaty expiring in 2026, it has no provision for any further extension. So any new arms control treaty would not only have to be new, but it would have to go before the Senate for consent and ratification. And when you look at the makeup of Congress today, that's probably something that's not immediately achievable. From a force structure perspective, the U.S. modernization program of record must be fully implemented as rapidly as possible to deter Russia and China. If Russia and China stay on their current trajectories, and nothing we have seen would indicate a change, although, of course, if the situation would improve, that would be different. But if they stay on these current trajectories, the composition of our forces must change. The program of record is necessary, but not sufficient to address the projected threat. And the report outlines ways in which the program of record must be supplemented. And there are a number of different options listed on page 47, 48, and 49 of the report. The program of record includes the replacement of each U.S. nuclear delivery system, the warheads, and a comprehensive modernization of U.S. nuclear command and control. The transition between the legacy systems, which we now have, and the new modernized systems will be difficult. It will extend over the better part of a decade, longer in the submarine force. So as a result, the U.S. must ensure that the legacy systems are sustained, and this decade of transition, this decade of danger, must be funded so that the nuclear deterrent remains safe, secure, reliable, and effective during the transition. And as unpleasant as it may be, for Congress and the administration, we already know that the new systems will be late and over budget, and we've already seen that in the case of the ICBM. Unfortunately, there's a growing risk of confrontation with Russia and China, or both, and this includes the risk of military conflict, including the possibility of nuclear use. So the Commission believes strongly that to deter and prevent nuclear conflict, the U.S. must increase its conventional forces, quantitatively and qualitatively, adopt a more resilient space architecture, modernize nuclear command and control, and advance integrated air and missile defense capabilities. Specifically on missile defense, the commission believed that we should look very closely at moving to protect some key critical infrastructure so that the U.S. isn't subject to a coercive attack that would potentially keep us out of coming to the aid of our allies. The commission notes that each theater is different geographically and will require different forces. As a result, flowing forces from one theater to the other, while necessary, it's not a substitute for for needed increases in capabilities and forces, particularly if we think that the conflict could be either simultaneous or it could be sequential in a very short period of time. Without more conventional forces to deter regional wars, the use of nuclear weapons regionally becomes more likely. And without significant conventional increases, the US will need to rely more on nuclear weapons, increasing the role of nuclear weapons and their saliency, certainly not a goal that the US has sought to achieve. While large-scale nuclear conflict, as I mentioned, remains unlikely, the probability of regional deterrence failure is increasing. The US needs a force posture capable of simultaneously deterring both Russia and China. Much of the infrastructure and industrial base that supports the Department of Defense and the National Nuclear Security Administration is out of date. It's unusable, and in some cases, it's literally falling down. Both departments are struggling with supply chain issues, and neither have enough capacity to meet future requirements on a timely basis. So investment in our infrastructure and rebuilding the supply chain and the workforce is needed urgently, and it will be needed in perpetuity. This is true for both the NNSA production and scientific infrastructure, which we cannot ignore, and the DOE and DoD industrial base. Finally, I would like to highlight the report's findings and conclusions on risk reduction. The Commission believes it is of paramount importance for the United States to work to reduce strategic risks. U.S. vital interests and international security are served by robust diplomatic engagement that reduce uncertainty and reduce the risk of deterrence failure and unnecessary arms competition. It is in the U.S. national interest to lead and be recognized as leading diplomatic efforts to reduce risk. U.S. nonproliferation efforts and the nonproliferation regime have slowed the spread of nuclear weapons, and U.S. and allied threat reduction programs have successfully constrained the availability of nuclear materials, technology, and expertise to potential proliferators. So with that, I will close and turn it over to you, Peter, for questions and questions for our audience. But I also want to add in closing that the work of this commission over 18 months was truly threat-informed. We spent a lot of time understanding what has changed over the last 20 years. We spent a lot of time talking to allies. We spent time talking not only to our intelligence community, but also to academics and think tanks and others with deep knowledge of Russia and China. And although I haven't spent any time today talking about either North Korea or Iran, we did certainly spend time talking about them as well. And one of the other things that became clear from all of this is that the U.S. has not focused on China and Russia as peer adversaries. We've been so focused, obviously, in the Middle East and on terrorism, which, by the way, I don't want to remove the focus from terrorism, and we're not trying to say that at all. But we just haven't had the resources to focus on Russia and China in the way that we need to focus. So one of our major recommendations is to the intelligence community to increase their capabilities, to increase not only the ability to predict and understand the hardware aspects, but also strategic intent. Why are they each doing what they're doing? What are the motivators for both Putin and Xi? What are the policies and what are their long-term goals? We found that there really is a fairly considerable lack of knowledge in these areas, and it needs to be improved because, of course, the last thing anybody wants is to have any war, let alone a nuclear conflict, start because of misunderstanding and misperception. So with that, Peter, I will close and look forward to a good discussion.
Madeline, that was a wonderful summary of what the commission did. And I'd sent you some questions earlier, and you've kind of answered some of them, but let me go to the first one I was going to ask, which is, some critics have said that the commission was panicked, that you kind of went overboard. One of the things I found fascinating is you did a threat assessment. You asked people to come talk to you. What surprised you about what they told you? Because you said something I thought quite interesting. We may have been wrong in the past. And so what we thought was, good and understanding the world was, oops, that's not the right thing, which happens. And I think that was part of it versus what we assessed 10 years ago. Can you answer that a little bit? Because that goes to my third question too, which was, what surprised you about what the commission found out?
So let me take on the whole question of panic. There was no panic. And in fact, even using that term in a question, I think undermines what we did. And it undermines the caution and the care that we exercised when we made our recommendations. We spent a lot of time really trying to understand what the current geopolitical situation was and how it had changed, because that is what's truly remarkable. When you do go back and you look at what the 2009 commission talked about, and you look at what that environment was following the recommendations of the 2009 commission, you had the New START treaty that was negotiated. You had President Obama's Prague speech. You had a nuclear posture review that was truly trying to move towards further reductions.
Right.
It was an era when we hoped that not only would the New START treaty be successful, but we really thought and hoped that there would be a follow-on treaty dealing with all of the rest of the systems that Russia has continued to build and expand upon. Best guess 2000 maybe, and it's that's not the world, and it's that evolution over 14, 15 years, and how much it's changed that.
True.
Not so much a surprise, but certainly is a lesson that we need to learn. So it wasn't panic, it was rational, it was thoughtful, and it was really because of this work that we did, understanding how things had evolved, understanding the current situation, talking to our allies, and talking to experts in this field, that led us to our conclusions.
We have a question here in the chat function before I go back to some questions I asked you previously that I listed. Question here says, from commission report perspective, what do you think about giving theater nuclear weapons to countries like Poland or Finland in the European theater to deter Russian aggression in Europe and the Arctic?
Well, so first is really you have to understand the whole concept of NATO, obviously, and NATO acts as a body, and everything is done by consensus. So if for instance NATO thought that it would be appropriate for U.S. weapons to be stationed in places where they're not currently stationed, that would be a NATO decision.
Right.
And it would have to be a NATO decision taken with great care, because clearly it would be contrary to the agreements that were made with Russia in the early days of NATO expansion. And I think we have to be very cautious, in the same way that we don't, that we want to make sure that there's not any inadvertent action through misperception, for instance. We also want to make sure that that our actions don't lend either Russia or China to some notion that we're doing something, or we have some intent that we're not. So it's just got to be a NATO question. Now, obviously, the Indo-Pacific is different, and that's why we talk a lot about options and capabilities that would be needed in that theater specifically.
Interesting. Given the fact that Congress commissioned you, said do this, what feedback have you gotten from the Hill? I know the Hill's a lot of people, 535.
Yep.
But my guess is those that had something to do with it have come back to you and had some, what's been the feedback?
Well, our charter, of course, was included in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. So our focus with the Hill has really been on the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. And we have hearings, we've had hearings with both and had really good feedback. And then there have certainly been follow-up meetings with individual commissioners, with individual members. And for the most part, I would say it's been well received. Obviously, there have been a lot of questions. There's been a lot of concern, of course, about money, understandably. But I think that one of the things to me is emblematic of the fact that this is being recognized. The report is being understood. The report is being thought about in a serious way. Is Senator Deb Fischer from Nebraska and Senator Angus King from Maine have put together a bill that basically implements a number of our recommendations, as well as doing other things. So there is a serious effort going on to really take some of our recommendations seriously. And my understanding is that they would like to get this bill ultimately included into this year's NDAA.
Could you address the issue of what the two senators put in their bill in terms of, because I was going to ask you the priorities of your recommendations, because some have to be done now and some are in sequence.
Yeah.
What did they particularly, do you know what they included in their version of the NDAA that took their recommendations
Yeah.
from the commission?
So it's a fairly long bill. And I don't know if they've actually released the text. They put out a press release of what's in it, and I've read their press release. So some of it's interesting, but in terms of our priorities and recommendations, I know we've gotten that question a lot. How do you prioritize your recommendations? We had 81 recommendations. Some of them, probably the ones that might even be the most important, were to Congress. There are 4 of them, and they generally deal with things like don't have continuing resolutions, have
Yes.
authorization appropriation bills done by the beginning of the fiscal year.
Yeah.
Look at how you fully fund programs. Make sure that you make sure that you have this funding that's fully funding so that you achieve the right system in the right time for the least cost. In other words, less incremental funding. And I don't think those 4, I mean, we had to say them, the hope of those actually getting implemented, I think it's small, but they're important, and you have to talk
Very
about them.
important.
I think the group of recommendations that we made for the IC that I mentioned about rebuilding this capability to really fully analyze and understand both China and Russia, that capacity attrited over the years. We need to rebuild that capacity. Again, very important. I don't know how you prioritize those two, because so much of this stuff has to be done. You look at the infrastructure. We have to have an infrastructure, or we're not going to have a capacity. The Navy is suffering from a lack of capacity in its shipyards. We know that the NNSA is suffering from a lack of capacity in its nuclear weapons production complex. We know all of these things have to be fixed. We know that we have a workforce shortfall. We don't have enough electricians. We don't have enough welders. I mean, all of these things have got to be addressed. And it's not all going to happen tomorrow. As I said, this is a very long game report. And this is going to take a very long time, but we need to start doing all of these things now so that we are prepared down the future. Did we want this world? Do we want to have
No.
conflict with 2 peers? Of course not. But to have the deterrence to deter this conflict,
Right.
potential for conflict, we have to have the ability.
Mark Quinn asked a question. It's a little open-ended, but having been a deputy administrator at NNSA, I'm going to ask it. It says, what kind of investments are required to right-size NNSA production capacity to respond to the threats and go beyond the program of record? What would be your priorities?
What would be so at the moment? The priority would be to make sure that there can be a production of 30 pits per year at Los Alamos, that the Savannah River plutonium production facility gets funded and gets built, that all the ancillary materials that the NNSA has to make sure are produced, lithium, tritium, there's a whole long laundry list of these other materials, that all of those capabilities get built. And even some of the new capabilities that you wouldn't think would be hard, like high explosive, even those capabilities need to be reconstituted. The lesson learned from all of this is we just stopped doing a lot of things for 20 years, and we don't know how to do them anymore. So, or we haven't done them in so long. So we just have to relearn this stuff. We have to rebuild these buildings. And I will tell you, I am much less worried about, how big is the building? Is it 100 square feet or is it 150 square feet? Because you always want a little bit of flexibility in there. It's the real problem is making sure that you don't stop in the future, and having the flexibility. So again, I mean, we are not talking about big increases, maybe no increases in the total stockpile, but we have to be careful when we talk about numbers, because we know the New START treaty is going to expire, and right now the prospects for something that would take its place are pretty bleak. So there's a difference between the number of deployed systems and the total number in the stockpile. True. One of the things that we recommend, we have looked at, and recommended that there be initial planning, as I mentioned, is the potential, for instance, to upload ICBMs. So that doesn't increase the total stockpile numbers. What it does is it looks at the ability to take some of these hedge weapons and upload them on the ICBMs if we need to.
Right.
We may not need to. I hope we don't. But if we need to think about what that would entail. And we also talked about flexibility. So just, because one of the things that is interesting, and it isn't sort of saying we endorse or we don't endorse, but the fact that the NNSA is planning to take some of the B6112 modernization program, and instead of 12s, they're going to take a few of those B6112s and turn them into B6113s. So they're not increasing the total number that they were going to modernize anyway, but they're introducing some flexibility, into those same numbers.
Okay. There's a question came from one of our listeners or one of our attendees. What European allies did you talk to that you can tell us about their particular contribution that you want them to enhance as well?
So I would say we talked in some form or fashion to all of our NATO allies, and what we also talked about is, what are those things that our NATO allies, as well as our allies in the Indo-Pacific, can bring to the table. Some of them obviously are well above their financial goals. Some are not quite there. But we also talked about how, and this is not really a money thing. This is much more of a, how do we plan together? How do we think about doing more joint development? How do we think about making sure that we really have interoperability? How do we understand how we can share things, how we can share intelligence, to probably a larger degree, how we can rely on our allies for things? Are there things that our allies can do that we can say, okay, you've got that? Or you've got that in the sense of you can augment what we need. Tankers would be a good example of this. Space capabilities would be a good example of this. So it's really urging the administration to seriously talk to allies, and allies to seriously talk to the administration to figure out what we can all do together to make sure that we take advantage of everybody's capabilities.
Interesting. I have done the last 3 years industry panels at my Triad conventions, and we've talked about workforce and supply chain, but workforce, the big thing. What did your commission learn? Because I get messages that our cyber, space, nuclear, conventional, and they're all competing with each other in some degree. And the question is, you don't just grow a PhD in physics or engineering, but what's your sense of where we are with that?
So when we talked to a number of different folks, it was pretty clear that we need capabilities across the board. And as I mentioned, we need more electricians. We need more computer scientists. We need more cyber specialists. And it's some of it is a question of both absolute numbers, but some of it is also a question of making working for the defense, for defense as well as government directly, to make it attractive. Sometimes I
Right.
have to say we make it really hard to work
Yeah.
for a defense industry or for a national lab or for NNSA or for DoD. Um, we had some discussions with folks about just how hard it is to get a clearance. And sometimes younger folks, they don't like to leave their phone at the gate. Okay. There are just some things that aren't attractive
Yeah.
about being in this workforce. Plus, the US, and again, this is a whole of government thing, and it's much bigger than DoD or NNSA. And this is really how do you get back real skills training?
That's true. Yeah. Um, you and I knew someone by the name of Les Aspin. He was my congressman when I went to school, and I got to know him pretty young. But we would come in and talk to him about how much Russia had, and he would said, "I'm not so much interested in what they have, what he called them beans." He says, "What are you going to do with them?" Now, this is to some degree hypothetical. It's guesswork. You mentioned something very interesting. You said we're not very good at assessing the objectives of the China Russia threats. What are they going to do with the weapons? Can you address what the commission heard? I'm not going to ask you to go out and tell me what you think necessarily, but what did the commission hear about? Because I often hear from people somewhat on the disarmament side of the business that our actions as a country have forced them to do things that we don't like, that our restraint could change that. That's one aspect of it. And I don't want you to get in, I don't want to beat up on my
Mm-mm,
arms control friends, but
mm-mm.
my worry is their objectives are very serious and deadly. And that's one of the reasons the threat assessment was so stark.
Yeah. So if you look at our first two chapters, the stakes chapter and the threats chapters, we talk about this in those chapters a little bit, but it was pretty clear to us that we don't always understand. And by this I mean, like, the whole US government doesn't always understand where China is going. I mean, obviously President Xi has made various and sundry comments over the years. They, want to be a global power, but what that really means is something that I think we have a lot to work on and a lot to understand. I mean, obviously there are all sorts of experts, and everybody has views on this, and I think that's excellent, and that's exactly what we need to do. Is we need to talk about this. We need to air more on about this. But I think in that same context, we also need to, and again, now this is my personal opinion, not the commission, but I think we really do need to take advantage of opportunities to talk, whether
Great.
they be track 1.5 or track 2 or official meetings. I was very encouraged last fall when President Xi and President Biden met and agreed to have some initial transparency talks. And Mallory Stewart over at State led, Assistant Secretary at State led some talks last fall. And you don't expect a breakthrough right away, but there is advantage in talking and understanding and sharing, um, to where it's just valuable, in my personal opinion. I think that's a good thing. Um, but so back to your other question in terms of what are they doing? And you know, Russia Russia has modernized their nuclear capabilities, and they did it on their own terms. And they've done it, well, initially, obviously consistent with the New START Treaty, but when you look at what they have, I mean, our things aren't anywhere as new as theirs. So they were in front of us. I mean, I know we talk a lot about the quote from Ash Carter at one point about, we're not in an arms race, everybody else is, but we're not there. But I mean, truly, when you look at the Russian systems, ICBMs, year deployed, 1988, 2019, 2006, 97, 2010, 2014, 2024, 2022. We don't have anything that compares. So in many respects, we're kind of playing catch up.
Yeah. That's very, very true. You and I, when you were in the Senate, we talked about missile defense in a way that was pretty much contained within the ABM treaty. You folks at the commission have endorsed air and missile defense in a new role, which can you explain a little bit? Because I think that's one of the most important things, which I think could lead to greater stability and actually a sense of lessening the coercion and blackmail that might go on with missiles armed with nuclear weapons.
So we definitely talked first about the whole ground-based interceptor program, next generation interceptors, the California and Alaska systems. And we talked about those a lot, obviously, in the context of what they're designed to do. And we don't challenge that policy at all. We did talk about the need to modernize them. We also talked a lot about research and development in missile defense. And we talked about, as research and development continues, when there really are breakthroughs, they should be implemented. When they make sense, they should be implemented. So is there more capability in space? Can you do better discrimination? I know obviously others, certainly missile defense and the Space Force are all working on these sorts of things. And, and we certainly endorse all that. The thing that was new is we really talked about understanding how to defend against coercive attacks. And these are the sorts of things that they're probably not even a nuclear attack. They're most likely conventional. But when we look at some of our critical infrastructure, we look at our basing facilities. All of our submarines are located in two places. Take Kings Bay. If there were a coercive attack against Kings Bay, what do the American people do? If there were a coercive attack against pick your favorite critical infrastructure. Is this something that would persuade the American people that they should not come to the aid of their allies if there was a conflict somewhere else, and then there was one of these attacks? Would political sentiment say no? Let whomever fight their own fight. We're not going to come to their aid. So we wanted to make sure that there are some air and missile defense capabilities that would be effective in preventing some of these coercive attacks. And again, it's all about deterrence. Can we look at capabilities to deter these attacks so that the adversary doesn't believe that the price of the attack is worth it? If they think it would be successful to keep us out, well, maybe then that would be worth it in their eyes. But we wanted to make sure that coercive attacks would not be effective.
Interesting. I'm going to turn it back over to our president, Jim Petrovsky, and see if he has any questions or comments he'd like to offer you. I have asked I did miss one question in the chat function, but you kind of answered it differently. So anyway, again, over to you, Jim.
Yep. Madeline, again, the National Institute for Deterrence Studies really thanks you for taking the time to be a part of this. I think it's exceptionally important that this information gets out into the community that we bring in, and I appreciate you taking your time. I did put a question in the chat function. I'd just be very interested in the in the response, because I'm always curious as to how people handle the concept of arms race, because we get beat about the head on this, vice avoiding, great power conflict. And I didn't know how the commission was able to balance these two, because, sometimes maybe we need to go to one to avoid the other. And I know one's larger. So how did the commission sort of handle this? That would be my only question. It was sort of left out here.
So I think I understand the question.
Sure.
But if I don't, address where you were headed, let me know. But fundamentally, and I mentioned it a little bit in my remarks, and it really goes back to the assumptions underpinning deterrence, and that's where we reinforced that the fundamental these fundamental tenets of deterrence are valid. So the administration has to take those fundamental elements of deterrence, look at still what does the adversary value, and how does deterrence work for that adversary? I mean, very simplistically, you're driving down the highway, somebody, and you're going 10 miles over the speed limit like everybody else, right? But somebody comes barreling up the side, at 100 miles an hour, and they go off, and they don't stop, that whatever. Why is that person not deterred from behaving like the rest of the traffic? That's kind of what we have to understand. And so that's, say that's the Russia or China. We have to understand what it's going to take to deter them. And it isn't always numbers. It's really understanding their calculus. What do they value? And it's shaping our strategy so that we can effectively deter them. And to be successful, we have to understand them better than we do.
Great. Very well. No, thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. Again, I'm always trying to tie that together. So again, I thank you. I thank our audience. I want to turn it back to Alex, who has some announcements on some of our future presentations for the seminars. Alex, turning it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Madeline, for that. And lots of takeaway. I like this whole of government approach and bringing Department of Energy into this conversation. We have a number of events, as always, and I'll put them here in chat. So we have coming up on May 3rd, Frank Miller on deterrence in a two-peer nuclear world. And then Rose Gottemiller and again, commentary on the commission report. And then we have retired General Rob Spalding on strategic deterrence in the age of TikTok. Furthermore, we do have a calendar now on our website that you can refer to and see these the HUSI events. So if you go to the link there in the chat, thinkdeterrence.com/event-calendar. So you should be able to see the events. And if you click on it, you'll get more information, including the link to join the meeting when the meetings are actually happening. All right, so thank you very much, Madeline, for that great supplemental insight into the report, which probably most people here have read. And looking forward to seeing everybody here for our next one on May 3rd. All right, and have a great rest of your day and weekend ahead.
Thank you.
And thank you, Madeline. We appreciate it deeply. We'll
Take
see
care.
you in Las Vegas.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.